This is the Knowledge Graph Insights podcast, episode number 22. The word semantics is often used imprecisely by semantic technology practitioners. It can describe a wide array of knowledge representation practices, from simple glossaries and taxonomies to full-blown enterprise ontologies, any of which may be summarized in a conversation as semantics. Mike Poole thinks of this dynamic, using a word that lacks precise meaning while assuming that it communicates a lot, may justify a moratorium on the use of the term.
Welcome to the Knowledge Graph Insights podcast, where experts on knowledge graphs and the semantic web share their wisdom with the digital and business communities. Our mission is to demystify and democratize knowledge graph technology and practices to make the benefits of knowledge graphs and semantic technology accessible to all. And now, here's your host, Larry Swanson.
Hi, everyone. Welcome to episode number 22 of the Knowledge Graph Insights podcast. I'm really happy today to welcome to the show Mike Poole. Mike is a longtime ontologist, like a couple decades plus. Recently took a position at Bloomberg, but he made this really provocative post on LinkedIn lately that I want to flesh out today. So, and we'll talk more about that throughout the rest of the show. But welcome, Mike. Tell the folks a little bit more about what you're up to these days.
Hey, thank you, Larry. So as you noted, I've just taken a position with Bloomberg. And as for these many years that you alluded to, I've been very heavily focused on doing knowledge representation in general. In the last, let's say, decade or so, I've been particularly focused on using knowledge, ontologies and knowledge graphs in like large banks or large organizations, at least to help organize disparate data, to make it more accessible, break down data silos, et cetera, et cetera. It's particularly relevant in the finance industry where things can be sliced and diced in so many different ways. So I find there's a really important use case in the financial space, but in large organizations in general, in my opinion, for using ontology. So that's a lot of what I've been thinking about, and to make that more accessible to the organization and to help them build these ontologies and utilize them effectively.
Nice. And one of the intellectual, I guess, foundations of that kind of practice is what we call semantics. But anyhow, I want to read part of that post you made on LinkedIn, which started a great conversation. One of the things you suggested, I think we need to impose a moratorium on the use of the word semantics. The reason is simple. It's ironically a term lacking any precise meaning while we assume it's communicating a lot. That's brilliant. Can you elaborate on that a little bit? Like, was there a particular, did something inspire that, or has it just been on your mind, or?
Yeah, I mean it's mostly so one term that often triggers it for me is this term I see, within this, let's call it this community of practice, that I see used very frequently, is the people will say, let's look at the semantic meaning, and so we've kind of this redundancy in terms that we said, well, what in the world? But we use it for all kinds of things, right? We say we need a semantic solution, we need the semantic meaning, and very often what that ends up being, when we drill into that, it's just not always clear. The term, I think, in some sense has become either too vague, right? Like it's unclear of what precisely it means, or it's sort of a shorthand for something else that we're not actually saying we're going to capture meaning. We're saying we're going to use this particular set of tools or something like that. So my concern is that it's sort of lost, or the people, or we know when we say it, that we mean we're going to use these particular set of tools, these particular set of languages, but the people with whom we're communicating, that might remain completely unclear. So yeah, that's sort of my concern about the way we're using the concept. So.
Yeah, that's really interesting that it's not laziness, it's like heuristics or something like that people use all the time to just try to advance whatever conversation they're in or project or whatever. It's just like, oh yeah, we need a semantic thing there or something like that. It sounds like, or they're thinking of like possibly 20 different things, or they just say, oh, semantic is the closest word I know to that idea that we need to advance this. That's
yeah, I mean, the example is like because I think, as I noticed somewhat ironically in my I herald myself as like a semantic technology, practitioner or something like that. And if you said to me, well, what in the world is semantic technology? It's like it's a good question. Like if I create a property graph, is that, there's part of me that says, well, that's not really semantic, but a triple store is. And it's like, well, what's the dividing line? What precisely makes it count as semantic or not, right? But we and it's it's a little bit hard to pin that down.
Yeah, that it's like the way you just said it, it's almost like there's an on-off switch someplace. But I've seen there's a lot of representations of like what various people have called like something like the semantic spectrum, from like just term lists to glossaries to thesauri to ontologies, that kind of thing. And there's it's easy enough to disambiguate between each of those things I just mentioned. But is there something like a spectrum in there? And is that why people are grasping for words, do you think, to describe like exactly what they're talking about in the moment?
Yeah, I don't. As I said, I think that's part of the problem. I think, as I said, the people with whom I often communicate, I think we more or less mean it as a shorthand for using RDF OWL, right? And that might be as simple as using SCOS and creating a simple taxonomy with that. Or creating a very elaborate OWL ontology. But it's interesting because these let's say we create a taxonomy in SCOS. Well, is there any reason that if you just had that taxonomy and you didn't bother to put it in SCOS, you just put it in an Excel spreadsheet with appropriate indentations? We'd say, well, how does the SCOS or how does the RDF magically capture the meaning where the spreadsheet didn't, right? It's a little bit unclear. But I think, as I said, but I think but that's the other people use it differently, right? Like I think they said there's lots of people who would say using a property graph is a semantic solution. We're capturing knowledge, et cetera, in it. So I think it varies a little bit. Again, part of the point. But I think I do believe, like, people with whom I communicate, we do, that's kind of the shorthand we're using. It's like this is like either technology that we use to extend RDF OWL, or it's a knowledge graph that encodes that knowledge. But that's often what it kind of means in my space, I think.
Yeah. And also, you mentioned in that post too, I think that like when you're talking about like if your intent is to capture meaning, that there are other ways to do that technologically. Like you talked about like just an old-fashioned ERD, or a graph schema or a Python script that captures something in some project you're working on. And even I think you also alluded to, or maybe it came up in the discussion, like it could be like a natural language thing that you say to an LLM that it could discern. So I guess that kind of gets at like, what is the amount of meaning you need to capture? And does that make sense? Like what's the intent behind your attempt to do something semantic in a technical project?
Yeah, it's a hard question. It's actually it sounds like a straightforward question, but it's actually a very good one, right? Because as I said, that if we say, well, we're trying to capture meaning, that you could write a Python script that does it, or there's a lot of different ways to do that. And I think this whole, at least like the background that I have in this, when we were talking about capturing semantics, what we were really concerned with is really trying to say, can we get a computer to reason in the same way that we do, right? Can we get the computer to kind of respond to natural language prompts in a similar way that a human can? And that's kind of what we meant by semantics. But then if we try to talk about that in the technology space, like what exactly does that mean? It's like, so let's take the Python script example. Why is like if I said, oh, I'm trying to solve this problem, I've got this, I've got this, I have this search engine, and every time someone's, I don't want it to, people are they're searching for recipes, and I want it to understand that if they're searching for recipes with fruit in it, or recipes with vegetables in them, I want it to understand that squash is a kind of vegetable, or that apples are a kind of fruit, or something like that. It's like, so what if we just embedded all that in a Python script? Why isn't that semantic? And so we say, in some sense it is, but I think what we get at is it would be insofar as we did that, and then we had it deployed for that very specific application. It's not very reusable. It's not very scalable, right? So part of what we think when we're trying to capture semantics, whatever that means, is we've created something that we can pick up and reapply to different pieces of software to use, right? Like so if I write a Python script, even if it did, it listed out all the different types of vegetables and it did the subtyping, we'd say, yeah, but it's not very semantic, because you've built it for this particular search engine, and now if I have another thing that's where I'm trying to figure out stuff about vegetables, you've built that thing for that search engine, it doesn't reapply. So we talk about the term sort of data centric is another term that gets thrown around in the community a lot, but I think there's something that we're trying to do is to say we want to have some kind of conceptual capture that we can pick up and move around. That's really kind of part of it, and extend easily. So I think that's why, that why is our intuition that a Python script isn't really capturing semantic? It's because you built that Python script for a single application, and you can't pick it up and use it in a different application.
So I think we're starting to disambiguate the use of the word semantics in technology versus like philosophy or linguistics. That's a very specific a bunch of needs. Especially, I had not really thought that much about the need for reuse. That like if you've gone to that trouble of identifying the meaning of something and how you're going to use it in that context. But that kind of gets to, like you mentioned both that like a specific application or use case like search, but you also mentioned like the notion of data centricity and like that notion of like that an enterprise having like all of its data in sort of a neutral sort of setting that could be used in any number of applications. That presumes that you can have meaning independent of an end application. Is that actually doable with semantic practice? I'm thinking about it. When I think about it, when I articulate it that way, it makes me wonder like where there might be details to be resolved.
Well, I think that's kind of the right the right kind of end goal to keep in mind, right? Like is to say, and there's there is a challenge with that insofar as sometimes if we get too focused on just worrying about the representing, capturing semantics, as it were, sort of independent of the application, we end up focusing on things that might not be salient to a particular use case. So I never say people should be capturing semantics without worrying about applications. It really, we need these use cases to figure out what of the semantic layer is or what in that semantic capture is relevant. But the idea would be is that, yeah, very definitely, whatever you're capturing, you say, I want to capture it for this part. Even if we're capturing it for a particular application, to be thinking all that time about like, if there's another application that's going to need this information, can I extend this easily, right? And that's what kind of allows you to have that independence. And I think again, that's kind of what as ontology practitioners, what we should be thinking about, worrying about, is to say, okay, am I creating sort of an ad hoc model here because I know exactly how this application works and I know exactly the performance requirements it has. So I've created this ad hoc model, but now someone else, in the banks we talk about, the front office and the back office and the middle office, right? What you want to say is, yeah, we get it that the front office is trying to work with customers who are coming in on the website, and the back office is trying to resolve accounts and things like that. But what you'd ultimately want is to say, I want to have some conception of customer or client that I can actually, reuse that thing across all those different spaces, even though if I were to tailor build a schema for each of those situations, they might look quite different. So if we think, yeah, I'll build this for front office, but is it going to extend easily for the back office requirements? And I think that's where you start getting into semantics. Because now you're thinking about there's something in common that all these different applications are talking about. Let's capture that. And it doesn't have to be a complete, full representation but it has to be something that kind of scales easily and extends easily, I think.
Yeah, as you were describing that, like that front, middle, and back office thing, I'm thinking of like, I've done a lot of work in enterprises where you have sort of like customer facing, designer and product facing, and then systems facing at the very bottom, analogous to what you just said. And one of those things but then also I think about ontology practice, and ontology is usually constrained by a domain, like you're aware of and constrain your concerns to that domain. I'm wondering, is semantics the boundary of that domain? I wonder.
I mean, I don't. I think it's the. I don't think it's necessarily the boundary of the domain. I think, as I said, I think in some sense the semantic part of it is to say, have you created something that allows us to kind of traverse those domains? I think good pragmatics for people doing modeling is to be domain focused, right? Like if you're creating a model of a human being and you're worried about it from a worried about it from a bank perspective versus a medical perspective, those models could be very different. But then again, but I think a truly semantic model would kind of recognize to say, oh, okay, here's how we can pick it up and extend it so that that is reusable across both those domains. So I mean, I think domains are useful, I think, as I said, so we don't try to model the world, right? Like if you think about I kind of suspect that part of what happens in this space is you think about what we try to do sort of in the early days of AI is to say, well, we want to do knowledge representations. We would just represent everything, right? We would just say, well, we want to know what a human being is. Well, they've got a heart and they have a brain and they have 10 fingers and they have all this stuff. And it's like, I think we started to recognize, but yeah, you can do these elaborate knowledge representations, but to make them useful, you really have to pick out a domain and be specific about it. So, but yeah, so I don't know the extent overlap of domain and semantics. I'm not completely sure.
Well, it occurs to me that maybe there's just semantics in what you mean by the boundary, what you mean by the edges of that domain. That's probably more than this, but yeah, the other thing. We're talking mostly about ontology here, and there's and again, I alluded earlier to that, mentioned earlier that semantic spectrum of just lists of words, and you talked about maybe a spreadsheet would serve just as well as an ontology in some situations or things like that. Is there sort of and I guess, is that like a maturity thing or just a utility thing? That range of sometimes you just need a list, sometimes you need a definition of it, sometimes you need to understand how it's organized. Sometimes you need a full-blown understanding of its ontological context. Is that a spectrum or a maturity range, or all of those things I just mentioned? Could those be considered part of the semantic world?
Well, like I said, I guess what I would be inclined to do, for us to be thinking about in these situations is a little bit less about what is semantic, and a little bit more to your point, what do we need to solve this particular problem, right? A simple list of words, a simple control vocabulary. If we think about document tagging or something like that, it may be the case we don't need to have really elaborate a really elaborate schema for doing that. But we do want to say, well, we want to have a control vocabulary so that you and I, when we're tagging documents, we're using the same concepts because it makes it easier to find. Now that might be something we want to make it extensible, but it never has to become much more elaborate than that. Now we may want to ultimately link it into other taxonomies or something like that. But the point would be is are we using semantics there? Well, in some sense, I don't care all that much, but it's just it's to say, well, how clear are you being when you're saying this is a semantic solution? I don't know, but if I say I'm actually creating a vocabulary, this control vocabulary, and by the way, I'm encoding it in SCOS, because that gives me a framework with which I can actually simplify linking of it to other taxonomies, et cetera. Am I capturing meaning? I don't know. Maybe I am, maybe I'm not, or maybe I'm making it easier for the systems to interact with each other. But but there's some utility in doing that, right? Is to say, instead of saying, oh, we're capturing semantics, which case you're saying, what are you creating an elaborate ontology of documents? It's like, no, it's just a tagging system, because that's all we need, right? So we don't have to overkill it there. And if we say, oh, and by the way, we think it makes sense to not just store this on a spreadsheet, but store it in a SCOS representation, because that makes it easier to store in our knowledge graph. That's a reasonable thing to do. Is it? But again, I wouldn't necessarily say that creating a list of document tags is you're not capturing much meaning there. You're just making it easier to tag. But
Right. And you just mentioned the idea that like you're tagging things with those concepts, and it's that connection between the labels of the terminology used to describe a concept and the actual that things not strings notion as Google articulated it. That's funny. I hadn't thought about that in the context of this, but like, is the meaning the thing and the string is just sort of application or context specific, I wonder? Or?
well, I mean, I think the strings not things thing is actually really like this term every started to use, that probably is like there's an awful lot to it that kind of gets to what we worry about as ontologists, right? Like it's it's extremely pithy, which is the sort of the beauty of it. But that really is kind of part of it, right? Is that what we want to do is create objects. Now, do those, if I reify an object to rather than have a string in a database, have I captured meaning? No, obviously not, right? Like there's nothing meaningful about that. But I have created a something that I can link to other things, or I can in the future make other assertions about, etc. So I haven't necessarily captured meaning, but I've created a framework in which I can start to link it to other things and maybe discover meaning, etc. So whereas I used to think the ontologist job was to verily create a thing, not a string. It also meant articulating everything that we knew about those things. And now I think maybe what the realization we've come to is just build that thing that you can now, because when you build that thing, you can link other things to it, or you can say more things about the thing, etc. So there's an awful lot of the strings not things. It's things not strings, not strings.
Yeah.
Maybe the order matters, but yeah, that actually is just a very, very insightful 3-word phrase. I think
and the way you just elaborated on it makes me picture like ontology practices like building lattice works that you hang things on, so that you can kind of get them tight, like the lattice being the domain, and I'm overwrought with that analogy already. But does that make sense? That like, is that kind of the part of the practice is like, okay, first let's get clear on the thing, the concept, the entity, the object, and then semantics is not like but it kind of comes a little later in the whole process.
Well, as I said, like I don't know, like if there's a magic moment where we say we're capturing semantics, but it is, but I think it's more kind of the way what we're trying to do in the space, but. Like sometimes capturing the thing is not nearly enough, right? Like my favorite example I always throw around is the concept of merger, which I discovered at one point can have very different meanings, like very different formal meanings, that can mean two companies come together and they both dissolve and a new one is created, or it can just simply mean two companies came together and one survived. But those are very importantly different concepts, and it's useful in our formal systems to capture that, right? Like so I wouldn't say, oh, we just have to reify this concept of merge and everything will be okay. It's actually important in those cases to say, to formally capture so that our computer systems can actually recognize to say, oh, there's two different databases capturing mergers, but they're using very different concepts there. So it's capturing meaning is important, right? But it's sort of important, sort of use case by use case as well.
Yeah, and what's in practice that the capture of the meaning? Is it like how much of it is just talking to people and looking at other ontologies or other expressions of things? Like how do you get, or I guess as you as a practitioner, as an ontology practitioner, how are you confident that when somebody says merger in the context of the system you developed, that they're using it in the right way or that it's understood in the right way.
Yeah, I mean that ends up, as I said, I've thought and worried a lot about like building ontologies in these large organizations, and I think a key part of doing that is really is to not necessarily be too ambitious about capturing that meaning at the outset, right? Where you say, hey, we know there's this important concept called a merger. We know this, customer is the other very famous one, right? Where it turns out that you go across an organization and everybody's using the term differently, but they thought they meant it the same thing. And you really almost need in those situations to say, well, let's create a very, very generic, let's capture this notion very generically. Maybe just, just have a node in our ontology for customer. And then, we want to facilitate the ability of different groups to actually extend that thing. And it might turn out that, when they actually capture the formal meaning of it in their space, it turns out to be very different. Now, that when you're actually capturing semantics, it's actually, I found it's sometimes important to have mechanisms in place so you don't try to resolve all that up front, right? You say, the problem that plagues our company is we don't have a unified model of what a customer is. But in order to do that, it turns out, you have a 6-month, a workshop and there's people, throwing things at each other because they're so upset about like enforcing their meaning. It's sometimes better to say, well, there's this general notion of concept where of a customer, we can all agree that it's somebody who exists outside the company that has some sort of relationship with the company. And then, people can extend their own definitions and things like that. But capturing semantics is sometimes a very iterative process in my experience. Because
and that notion of iteration, I'm thinking back, this comes up almost like half the conversations I have. Jim Hendler's notion of a little semantics goes a long ways. I wonder if that's part of what he was getting at, that like, just think about it and put it in a little bit at the start, and then you can do more with it later. Or I don't want to speak for him, but
no, I think that's kind of what I think about that too, is like is that if you create kind of you almost create, you can almost think of it as almost a category or something like that, and then people can say, oh yeah, you're talking about customer, I'm talking about customer. And now when we actually try to see how we're using it within our systems, we want to capture more meaning around it because we want to validate it, right? Somebody wants to bring in a new customer database or something like that. We want to say, we want to capture the meaning more formally. It turns out people have been using it in different ways. So then you iterate on that and you say, okay, well, maybe we need to have different classes of customers, or maybe we need to have different name graphs in which we allow for different shackle constraint sets or something like that. But I think that's actually an interesting point, whether you're saying that a little bit of semantics goes a long way, is like kind of create your beachhead of meaning, and then you can iterate on it and capture it more extensively or formally as you iterate and try to understand it.
I love that image of a semantics beachhead. I'll share with you after this, and I'll put it in the show notes, my favorite meme about language. But anyhow, hey, I can't believe it, Mike. We're coming up close to time already. But before we wrap up, is there anything you want to revisit from the conversation, or you just want to make sure we share before we wrap up?
Well, I mean, I guess the one thing that I think about a lot is like when I think about what I've been trying to do in the semantic space is the notion of capturing meaning. We find that these large language models or even like word embeddings and things like that actually do a lot of the work that we thought we'd have to do with ontologies, right? So there's a certain kind of effort devoted to capturing semantics that has been solved for us, right? So there's kind of a new question of what is the role of this kind of more formal knowledge representation, the thing that we mean when we say semantics, kind of in this world. And I think it kind of turns out like it actually means kind of what we ended up doing, and that's like kind of creating these knowledge schemas or these models that make it easy for us to interoperate and kind of to your point that we extend sort of on a use case basis rather than trying to have a full massive capture of it. But those ontologies end up being really important, not so much for capturing the meaning, but more for being able to interoperate across these different systems and be able to then plug into these LLMs that can do some of that semantic understanding for us, right? An LLM can maybe disambiguate terms and then send that information, send queries over to a knowledge graph that's been organized with respect to some ontology. We've let the LLM do some of that semantics for us, but the ontologies still play a central role for us to now, just pass information back to that LLM. So I think, as I said, I'm realistic enough not to suggest that we really stop using the word semantics, but it really is a word that often requires further elaboration, and I think, in a certain level of humility, that it's not ontologies alone that are capturing these semantics. So.
Nice. I love that. That's a great, and this is just, and that's how that post came across as like a conversation starter. And this little conversation was just a continuation of that, and there'll be plenty more to talk about. And I'm sure it's going to evolve quickly as we see people using, figuring out the true role of ontology in this new LLM heavy world. Hey, one very last thing, Mike, if folks want to connect with you or follow you online, what's the best place to find you?
Yeah, probably LinkedIn is the best place. I think my I'm just Mike Poole on there, linkedin.com/Mike Poole, I believe, is the simplest way.
Yeah, I'll get that.
I think there's a punctuation problem. There may be more than one Michael Poole, but my there's no E in my surname, so that might be one way to help you disambiguate. But,
excellent. Yeah. I will disambiguate it in the show notes for sure and include it there. Well, thank you so much, Mike. I really enjoyed the conversation.
Yeah, my pleasure. Thank you for inviting me. It's fun to talk about this.
For show notes and to sign up for our newsletter, visit our website at knowledge-graphinsights.com. And please rate and review us on your favorite podcast platform. Thank you for listening.